So today, close. Today's lecture is looking at siege warfare. Actually, more the word I'm looking for, a siege earthworks and the evidence of sieges. That's what we're looking at today. But unusually, we're going to go straight off on a tangent and we're going to come back to it. We're going to come back to where we're meant to be looking at. And we turn to Scotland. We turn to the two words, vitrified fort. Or just to upset Bill, vitrified hill fort. Now, the concept of siege warfare is literally everywhere. But the concept is usually portrayed in the wrong way. And what am I on about? Bill has visited Maiden Castle with me. Others have visited other hill forts with me. And what you will find everywhere is, and I'm not going to degenerate what we're doing today by showing you an image. Everywhere alongside a hill fort, a defended enclosure, for the sake of argument, we're going to call it a hill fort today. You find a little plaque showing a load of Roman soldiers in full armour, one at the front with a shield and another one with a shield alongside it, one with a shield above, shields all along the side, and what they do, they go up to the ramparts, right? And they try to break in through the ramparts with people above chucking projectiles on the Roman shields and all the rest of it, and loads of people getting killed. Right? Every hill fort you see that, but things are changing, and I must remark that things are changing, because I'm actually seeing Cadw signs and plaques altering to come in with what archaeological thinking is. They haven't exactly got there, but there's this concept that every Iron Age defended site, enclosure, hill fort, whatever you want to call them, was besieged by the Romans. Okay, there's that concept, there's that mindset out there, and I straight away would say that out of the 5,000 hill forts that have been excavated in Britain, no, start again. There's 5,000 hill forts in Britain, only 1% have been excavated, and not a single one of them shows any sign of anyone being killed, any siege or anything. There's no evidence of any siege at any of these hill forts anywhere except Scotland, where we come across the concept of the vitrified fort. Right? That's what archaeologists say. They say that the 50, 60 vitrified forts in Scotland, because the stone is actually fused and burnt, right? That's evidence that the Romans besieged forts in Scotland, but nowhere else, right? We will see that that is nonsense. When the Romans were approaching the Roman fort, when the Romans were approaching the hill fort, and it's a proper hill fort, Maiden Castle, in Dorset, they approached it in a very strategic way. When the Romans had come across the ancient Britons and fought against them, we're told, as they headed towards London, the army split into three groups. One of the groups headed towards the south coast. And we're told it headed from London all the way down to Reading, Caliver, Atrebatum, Silchester, just south of modern day Reading. So they headed all the way down there. And the army was led by the future Emperor Vespasian, General Vespasian, Legator Vespasian. And he led the Second Augusta Legion, heading all the way from Caliver Atrebatum, which was a friendly locality for the Romans. They started to build a town in the Roman way known as Lepidium at Caliver Atrebatum, and the Roman military then headed all the way down to Maiden Castle. Whether they got there within a few months of their invasion in 1843, or whether they got there the year later, they headed towards Maiden Castle. And as they headed towards Maiden Castle, so they could get communication back and forth, they decided to build a Roman road. You can't build a Roman road if everybody's killing you all the time. So they built a Roman road. The concept that I've always said is that as the Roman road was approaching Maiden Castle, the people who were, brackets, defending Maiden Castle thought, bloody hell, what's this coming towards us? Let's give up the ghost and run away, right? But in fact, the reality is very, very different. The reality is, as the Romans were approaching, whether they were building a road or not, they probably got to Maiden Castle by sea, rather than building a road. It's far easier to jump on a few boats. Within a few days, you're on the south coast, and then you're heading towards Maiden Castle. Why faff around with that silly little story I've just told, which I used to tell a lot, actually. As they approached Maiden Castle, the Roman army supplies would have been running low. We all know in warfare that an army marches on its stomach. When Sherman was heading from Atlanta in 1863 to 1864, all the way through to Atlanta, all the way through to get to the coast to defeat the Confederate States of America, they had to use the landscape to supply the army. They had no supplies. Their supply lines were being cut all the time. They had to get what they could off the land and feed themselves. An army marches on its stomach. The Roman army was the same. If it marched across the land, right, it would have been running out of supplies. As the army hit the south coast, it would have also been running out of supplies. The Roman army marched on its stomach. And as it reached Maiden Castle, it had a dichotomy. And the dichotomy was this. Do they besiege it and kill the attackers, and at the same time kill the defenders, and at the same time risk losing all the grain and all the animals, not being able to feed the army? Or do you come to some agreement with the people who actually used that site? The answer is you came to an agreement. There is not a single piece of evidence that Maiden Castle was ever besieged. Not a single piece of evidence. Don't correct me a minute. Not a single piece of evidence. Nothing at all. And we then know that the people then who were responsible for looking after Maiden Castle, with the thousands of farmers across the landscape, were to be rehoused in a new city at Dorchester, which was literally 1 mile away from the earthworks at Maiden Castle. And they could not have been rehoused at Dorchester if they'd all been killed by the Roman army. That's another fact. The Romans needed the local people, the Durachigi people in that area. They both needed each other. They needed Pax Romana. The Romans needed the local people to farm, to create the crops, to feed the people, and to feed the Roman army. Everyone needed to work together. That's exactly what happened. And within a few years, Maiden Castle became a large farmstead for one farmer, and then what happened is the landscape was reorganised, and then the Romans built a temple there and all the rest of it. That's reality. We know that. There's no evidence of any siege at all. And it's also said by many top-class historians and archaeologists that there was no practical way of defending Maiden Castle. The banks were so huge and vast, but they were so vast. You needed a large, well-equipped army to defend a hill fort like that, when in fact, the people in the valley that Maiden Castle commanded were also having to look after the fields. In fact, Maiden Castle was probably only 100 people living at Maiden Castle at any one point in time, and they were there to look after animals and grain. I use the fox scenario, not the wolf scenario, not the bear scenario, it's the fox scenario. I've heard of one single fox wiping out a whole flock of chickens, right? Michelle's got chickens, I've kept chickens. I had chickens a few years ago. I had 17 chickens, they were wiped out in one night, right? My cockerel was killed. They were all killed by one fox. It was like a bloodbath. Every single one of the chickens had their throats gouged. And my cockerel was so afraid he suffocated himself. It was a horrendous scene. And I used the fox scenario. One fox could decimate a flock of 1,000 chickens in one night. And it's very likely that those defences were not only to ward off human beings, they were there to ward off animals. And the animal as lowly as the fox. The fox could do untold damage. That's what those defences were for. They would defend against animals as much as they would to keep what you've got safe. And the other thing as well is if you want to build great defences like that, another tribe a few miles away wouldn't have been interested in what you had because they had to keep what they've got safe as well. There was not constant warfare in the Iron Age at all. We don't have much evidence of it. And this silly theory that hill forts were besieged came to a head in 1936, just before the death of Sir Mortimer Wheeler's first wife, Lady Wheeler. He needed money to keep the excavations going at Maiden Castle. And he happened upon 50 burials at Maiden Castle itself. 50 burials. Each of these burials had an individual grave. There were a couple of burials, you know, a loving couple with... And he said, right, this is evidence. These 50 bodies are evidence of a great siege at Maiden Castle. They're clear evidence of it. But then later on, archaeologists realised that Sir Mortimer Wheeler was spinning a bit of a yarn. He was spinning a little bit of a yarn. I've had to spin a little bit of a yarn in my own dissertation, right? Because it's methodological what I'm doing with my dissertation. I've had to bend a tiny little fact, nothing much. But the fact of the matter is, Sir Mortimer Wheeler bent the information, and a few weeks later, after this news hit the Times newspaper back then, there were thousands of visitors. And there were thousands of people giving money to the excavations at Maiden Castle. Years later, archaeologists would turn around to say to Sir Mortimer Wheeler, this body here is lovingly laid out, and there's a pot alongside it, and there's some of the items that they actually owned. This is not evidence that somebody's been killed in a battle. Sir Mortimer Wheeler said, I know. What about this one with a ballista bolt lodged in the person's spine? It's been radiocarbon dated. That person was not killed at any siege associated with Maiden Castle because the death post-dated any possible siege. This person had come from somewhere else, some other conflict of some kind. Each and every single one of those burials post or predated this supposed siege. Siege has never ever taken place. So what I wanted to do now is look at this wonderful thing known as vitrified forts in Scotland. And these vitrified forts are wonderful things. If you look at that there, 50 to 60 forts in Scotland, many as 100, through the entire circuit of defences, show signs that the stone has melted. Melted. Completely melted. And what I want to do now is cut the slide. Second. And I want to go with my notes. So put the light on. We're doing vitrified forts for a reason. Because other than that one example at Maiden Castle, archaeologists would then argue Sir Mortimer Wheeler was wrong there, but in Scotland we've got these examples that the Romans besieged these forts and then set light to them. Exactly the same way. Well, not quite. And for 250 years, archaeologists studying ancient Scottish ruins have reported a type of construction that they say defies explanation. I tell you, that's really highly insulting. We all know that nobody was in the Iron Age was capable of making iron. Nobody was capable in the Iron Age of making pottery because they couldn't get the temperatures up in the kilns. In fact, what I've just said is a load of nonsense. It's called the Iron Age because they're able to get the temperatures of the kilns beyond 1,250 degrees C to make iron in the first place. So they could certainly have the technology to heat up stone that could melt it. We've got examples of pottery being produced in the Iron Age that they left the switch of the kiln on too long, and all the pots in there completely melted and fused together. They had the technology. But for some strange reason, archaeologists can't get it into their heads that things change and things alter, and we do have explanations. And it goes back to the old thing. By saying that the Nazca people were not capable of creating the Nazca lines is highly insulting. It's the same as me. I'm going to insult you now, George. You couldn't create a stone wall. You wouldn't be able to do it. Or you weren't much of an engineer, Bill, because you didn't know anything about engineering, right? But both of you created wonderful things. By saying that you can't do it is highly insulting. By saying people in the past can't do things is highly insulting. Every time. Archaeologists almost feel that they've got to say that it wasn't possible. I saw a program once about building the pyramids, right? They had this American archaeologist and this British guy and an Egyptian guy, and they said, right, we're going to create a pyramid like the Cheops pyramid in Egypt. And somebody turned around and said, it's just not, you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to find the materials. But we'll have a go. And they sat down and thought, we can't. What we're going to do, we're going to build a corner of the Great Pyramid itself. Just one single corner. I don't know, the size of this square, right? We're going to give it. And they failed. They weren't able to do it. They said, right, that proves it. The aliens must have built these pyramids. There's no way they could have done it, right? But everyone knows in this room, if you're trying to create something, you've got to create the whole thing. The reason why they weren't able to do it was because the way the pyramid acts is that everything supports each other. You've got to have four sides to a pyramid, not just a corner. It just don't work. It's like trying to create an arch, trying to reconstruct a bridge arch, but only putting two of the stones together in the middle and expecting it to stand up. It's just not going to happen. So these vitrified forts, archaeologists still argue that these vitrified forts were all burnt down by the Romans. They will argue that. The rocks that make up the walls were originally stacked dry with no mortar. But after the whole thing had been constructed, a rectangular a rectangular raised area with a ditch around the outside, or a circular raised area with a ditch around the outside, oblong, any shape you want to look at. But that bank around the top, that stone bank itself, the stones are fused together. Sometimes on the outside, sometimes on the inside. And it almost looks like some of it has been transformed into glass. It's been fired at a high temperature. I was asked the question today, what materials did they use? Well, Scotland's full of igneous rock, metamorphic rock, sedimentary stone. The best stone to use is sedimentary stone. If you try and heat granite up, you've got really high temperatures to do it, but they were able to do that anyway. Right? They used all types of stone. How was it done? How was it possible? Oh, and then archaeologists argued, actually, this is all explainable because they did some atomic testing in Scotland in the 1950s. And that proves that the atomic testing temperature was so intense that these earlier hill forts and the stone was heated up at such a temperature that they look like they've been melted, and it looks like it's been done in the past. And then somebody said to the archaeologists, actually, there's been no deliberate atomic testing in Scotland. And by the way, there's a few of these sites in Scotland where people live. And I'm sure they'd remember an atomic bomb going off with their daughter who's got 3 legs. You know, it's just archaeologists wanting to find an answer, and they get things wrong. It's not a mystery at all. Oh, and then other archaeologists argued that the Romans, when they were besieging these sites, they had a super weapon. They had actually invented atomic bombs in the Roman period. And whenever they found forts that resisted, they would chuck the bomb over and it would heat the whole thing up and everything would be vitrified and people would melt. Can you see how bizarre and ridiculous these things are? But people do write these things. The most important thing is they do exist. These vitrified forts do exist. Knowing that they exist You need an answer. And what's all this about? What's the ramifications of all this? Who did all this? And some of the answers are here. So let's begin with our first and most important question. Do vitrified forts exist? Yes, they do. Ancient stone walls with their sides melted into glass. Yes, they do exist. There's about 50, 60 of them. Some of them can't be described as forts at all. They're just the size of this room, a bank. And it happens that the stones on the outside look like they've been melted, but the stones on the inside don't. Sometimes the stones on the inside look like they've been melted, the ones on the outside don't. Other times, on the outside and the inside the wall, it's been melted. So there's different ways of making these things. Big enclosed areas. And the way these were constructed was quite simple. When actually decent, normal, sensible archaeologists like me have excavated them, wanting to find some real evidence, they've taken a slice through this stone, right? And they found out that in fact, the way they built it, they'd have a timber here, timber on the front, timber on the back, fill it with stone, platform, more timber, stone, platform, more timber, and they build it that way. Okay? And that timber itself found, which hasn't been burnt or charred, they've radiocarbon dated it. They've got loads of radiocarbon dates. And guess when this timber dates from? Before we go on to that, for the timber to be within the stonework itself, it would mean that was there just before the stone on the outside became vitrified. Simple case is that the timber itself was burnt, and was burnt in such a way, we don't know how they did it, but they did do it. It was burnt in such a way that the temperatures were raised so high they were able to get 1,200 degrees in the open air to be able to melt the rock. Radiocarbon dates for the timber. It must have been done by the Romans. We will go with all this. Therefore, when the Romans got there, it must have been done by the Romans. Got to have been done. Those were the only ones who had the technology. Rubbish. They dated the radio by using radiocarbon dating on the timbers. The latest possible timber, the latest possible date when the timbers were burnt. In archaeology, we would call that a terminus antiquem date. It was 300 years BCE. 300 years BC. 380 years before the Romans ever got to Scotland. This was done by local people. It's nothing to do with the Romans. The Romans never ever besieged those forts, enclosures, hill forts at all. And when you're talking about hill forts, lots of hill forts are not on hills at all. That's your point. Vitrification is not easy to spot. Some archaeologists looking at the site, they almost see that the stonework is almost a pure rock face. That's because all the beds of stone have been melted together and become one. A bit like Carboniferous limestone, which you see around it. Carboniferous limestone looks like it's one block with little holes in it. There's no layers to some Carboniferous limestone. It looks like that. Some of it looked really white, some of it looked really black, and then some of it looked like as if it was lava-y like. There's lots of different stones in Scotland. Looked like lava, And then on some of them you'd find little drops of stone at the bottom. And that was the sign all the way around that the stone itself had been set alight. And this is really, really interesting. And this didn't only happen in Scotland, it happened in other parts of the world as well. We know that lots of people who were responsible for making these structures, rather than calling them hill forts, would have had blacksmiths with them. They would have needed metal tools. They would have needed iron tools to have felled the trees in the first place. Shut up, Bill. Nothing about the ancient pyramids. So when the archaeologists study these vitrified forts and they bring in other experts, the other experts to say, that there has been heated up. The archaeologist is not trained to see all these things. If you bring in other experts and they say, right, a volcanologist would be able to spot if a stone's been heated up. Take a volcanologist up there, stone's been heated. Oh, right, really? I thought it was natural. They did an experiment in the 1960s, and there was another experiment in the 1930s as well. Unfortunately, the archaeologists were a bit dim in their experiment. Before we go on to that experiment, I'll tell you something now. Archaeologists, when they reconstruct things, cut corners lots of times. I went to St. Fagans years ago, right? And when they built their first house at St. Fagans, the experts said to the people reconstructing the buildings and the archaeologists, don't use pine, okay? Pine is not much good for building, and it doesn't last, doesn't have a longevity, okay? You can use it for 1 or 2 beams in a structure, you know, if you cover it with slate, it's fine, right? But pine itself is not a good material to build with. And after a few years, they couldn't work out why the roof was starting to fail. They couldn't work out why the timber that they used was rotting quite rapidly because the whole thing was made of pine. They couldn't work out why the building only lasted 10 years. The archaeologists sat down and thought, right, in the Iron Age, every 10 years they must have built a new house. And the experts said, no, they didn't. You've used the wrong material. Oh, we've used the right material. We've proved it. No, you haven't proved anything. In this part of Wales, in this part of the country, they wouldn't have had pine. They would have actually have had oak and elm. Oh, but we couldn't get hold of elm, but you could get hold of oak. And as soon as they started building houses out of oak, instead of lasting 10 years, it lasts 20, 25 years. And then the archaeologists would turn around and say, I told you so. Buildings in the Iron Age lasted 25, 30 years. Yeah, right. And I saw the thing at Cosmester Medieval Village when I was working out as a volunteer years ago. They decided that they were going to have one of the roofs made of pine, beautiful pine roof, right? Wonderfully made. All the woodwork was absolutely perfect. Wonderful thatch roof. The thatcher said, "This ain't going to work. I've never thatched a roof with pine before. Pine purlins." Pine king post and all the rest of it. I've never done this before. It's always oak I've worked with. This ain't going to last. Within 10 years, the roof was collapsing. Anyway, the point with all that is that archaeologists don't blooming learn. They had an experiment in the 1960s. They decided to build a small length. 6 foot wide by 6 foot high, about 10 foot long. They decided to see if they could reconstruct a vitrified fort. Yeah, it's not, is it? You can see that. There's no curves or bends. That's our vitrified fort, just one length of wall, right? And what they did, they had interlacing beams with the slabs, horizontal beams, and all the rest of it, right? And then what they did, on the outside, both sides, interior and exterior, okay, they built a huge fire with brushwood. Within 3 hours, the whole thing had collapsed. They managed to get to between 800 and 1,200 degrees C, and they managed to find rock droplets at the bottom. But in the archaeological report, it said it can't be done. If we can't do it, if in the past it would have all collapsed. No, it wouldn't have. If they'd have built the whole thing, as one thing wanted to give in a little bit, it'd be supported by the next bit. It'd be supported by the... It's called structural integrity. You can't get structural integrity with a little length like that. And that's why they got it wrong. So then the archaeologists in the 1960s said, that wasn't the way they did it. There must have been an atomic blast or something. And when archaeologists make that mistake, reconstructing archaeology to try and prove something and reconstruct it in the wrong way, you know, they're not really understanding anything. The reality is that these people built vitrified forts. They did it all themselves. They actually built these forts. They had the technology to do it. They had the technology, and mistake after mistake, they were able to do it. There was also, they sectioned some of it, right? And what they did, they could see with some of the forts that what they would do, they would have a section of wall, the interior of the wall, just a section of wall, and they would build a fire on both sides, right? And that would heat up the wall and it would start to melt it. And then, parallel over here, they would do the same, and they would backfill it with other stone, and then they would build up again, like building a wall with lime mortar. You do it in sections, right? Heat that up again, perfect. And then, for luck, right, when it's all capped off, you have another fire, it all fuses it together, job done.
So they actually burn the timber.
Yeah.
To fuse what's inside the shanty.
It's all fused together. Yeah.
What's the rock? Was it igneous rock they using?
You've got sedimentary rock, igneous rock, you've got metamorphic rock. You've got, as you know, right, sedimentary rock, heated up, metamorphic, right? So it can change. So they wouldn't have known that, but that's fact. So there's no chosen material, but it's believed that not only did they get temperatures of 1,200 degrees C, they got temperatures hotter than the temperature required to heat iron.
Did they do that because they were aware of what lime water was, or didn't have lime water?
It was easier.
So
Oh, but yeah, actually, lots of places in Scotland you don't get limestone. Yeah, because lots of it is really old rock. But that's probably not the reason at all. They probably did it because it was the way to go, and we know that the people who built these had the technology to do it, and the vitrified forts were not the evidence and actions of besieged Romans, were in fact the actions of people 300 plus years before the Romans got to Britain. So, in fact, we've got not one single piece of evidence to say that a single fort, defended site in the Iron Age, was ever besieged by any Roman at all. Which is a very interesting thing indeed.
And all these are in Scotland, or?
Yeah, most of them are in Scotland. There are one or two on the continent, but that's it. And the other thing as well is, archaeologists used to argue this, right? Somebody used to say, right, we've got a vitrified fort, yeah? Explain it, Mr. Archaeologist. And they would give them some facts. They would say, right, we've got a site 4 times the size of this room, and there's a ditch around the whole thing, and there's a bank of stone. Just on the outside of the stone, right? All the stones being fused together, right? The archaeologist said, I got you. What the Romans did, they built they put timber around the whole hill fort, and because the people didn't surrender, we just set light to it. Proof. But in fact, in history, you don't do that. If you're trying to get into a fort, a defended site, you concentrate everything on one area. Everything. In the Napoleonic War, they used to call it a breach. British troops would besiege a French fort in Spain, and they would call it the breach. You would have one area where you pound and pound again, and then you would have a regiment with a crack company known as the Forlorn Hope, and the Forlorn Hope would charge into that breach and get into the fort hopefully capture it, right? The fact of the matter is, in military strategy, you focus everything on one area, just one area. Forget about the rest. So this thing about putting timber around the fort, risking your men's lives to just get them to become Roman is ridiculous. So then something else was thrown at the archaeologists. They actually said, right, you've got a vitrified fort, and it's only the fusing of the stone is only on the inside of the fort. And the archaeologists would turn around and say, that's proof again it was besieged. What the Romans did, this gets really ridiculous now. What the Romans did, they
tossed all the fire.
When the people were out, right, hunting, they would set light to the fort and they wouldn't be able to use it again. You know, all these stupid, silly things. And then this whole idea about forts being besieged by the Romans, that's completely crumbled. It just completely goes out the window. So what we're going to do now, vis-a-vis, we're going to look at sieges in the period of the British Civil War. So let's go for it.
Basically, we discovered that we made vitrified walls for endurance, to make them,
strong and powerful to last a long time.
They wouldn't fall down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The thing is, right?
So where did they actually discover that? When did they find it?
They've been coming across this idea of vitrified forts for 250 years.
Oh.
And it's just.
I must admit, I've never heard of them.
It's ridiculous that we don't give our ancestors credit where it's due. It's highly insulting to say they can't do things. It really is. As much as it's insulting by turning around and saying to me, you can't come here every week and do these classes because you're not capable of doing it. Well, I've been doing it for bloody ages, you know. And these things were done. Right, so we've got an image now. George, stop playing with my doodah. And a partridge in a pear tree. There you go. That there is a very large, well, it's not a musket ball, it's probably from a handgun of some kind, from a time at the in the Civil War. You know, those guns that you would prop up with a large barrel, okay, and that's about an inch in diameter, okay, just so it's fairly large, and that's a musket ball, or it'd be fired as like a grape shot from the cannon of the day from the British Civil War. Now I'll set this one out. So here we go, and here we go. So this is direct evidence of the idea of a siege. And why? What's this got to do with the siege? We'll come on to that in a short while. Now, this next image is of my. Oh, this next image is a very interesting one. In about 1400, late 1300s, about 1400, we've got evidence in Britain of proper cannons. Okay. Proper ordnance, you know. We've got the first cannons being used in Britain, and one of the earliest cannons we see being used in Britain was found down a well in Cardiff Castle, probably dumped down there by troops who were soldiers in Old England doing as army, because it's dated from about 1400. Now, as the 1400s went by, 1500s, it was soon realised that the castles of the day were no obstacle. The walls themselves were no obstacle to anyone getting in, because all you need to do is set up a cannon and pound the walls and you're in. So sometime in about the 1500s, it was realised that those stone walls, if you cladded them with meters and meters of earth, when a cannonball is fired at where the wall is, it just embeds itself in the mud. And then what it was realised at the time of the British Civil War in the 1600s, 1640s, the defences themselves weren't made out of stone anymore. They were made of mud. They were made of earth. And you'd have something like this. So if this is like defending, I don't exactly know where this is, but say this is the town of Newark up north, which had defences very similar to this, and I got an image of one coming up. It would be zigzag like this, and it'd be all earth. And then Newark itself was besieged by the parliamentary forces. So what the parliamentary forces did, they reversed this and had a triangle here, bit of straight, a triangle here, bit of straight. You know what I'm talking about. Like a load of teeth coming together. You can't have teeth coming together like that. You've got to have teeth going together like that. So that's what's happening. The defences are all the way around the outside. And in fact, this form of defence using earth was invented in the 1500s in places like Italy. And then they're using this exact same of warfare in the American Civil War and in that pointless war, the Great War from 1914 to 1918. So it's exactly the same way of warfare, nothing had changed. This using trenches used earth, zigzag trenches. That's it. Nothing had changed. And then something else moved on. What are these defences about? Okay? And these defences, if you're going to encircle them with these earthworks, it's to stop people getting in and it's to stop people getting out. And what do we mean by that? It's quite simple. Many times, particularly in the American Civil War, but many times in the British Civil War, stately homes were being besieged by the parliamentarians. Sometimes the royalists. Got one example of that in a second. But usually by the parliamentarians, because it was the rich people who supported the king, right? Who raised armies to support the king. And we've got writings about that the people inside didn't know what was going on. One or two stately homes held out long after the king had surrendered, and they didn't know what was going on. And at times through the Civil War, because the stranglehold of these forts was so tight, the parliamentary troops would shout over, "The king surrendered!" And the men inside would think, what are we fighting for if the king surrendered? And they would say, right, nobody's coming to rescue you! They can't get in! And people would get really disillusioned. In that case, we'll give you free passage! You common people like us! Jump over the defences and we'll leave you free! Because there was no communication, they didn't know any better. So people would just jump over the defences and run towards the parliamentary defences and then swap sides. In the Napoleonic War, the French used a very devious tactic. When the French were besieging British positions, what the French would do, they would work out the troops who were being commanded by the English. Who were they? And if they were, for example, the Irish troops, because the Duke of Wellington hated his Irish troops. He referred to them as scum of the earth, but they still died for the Duke of Wellington. Duke of Wellington was Irish himself, so we could say that. And sometimes what the French would do, they would completely put a stranglehold on the British location. And then they would chuck over pamphlets over the wall with terrible things like saying, back over in Ireland, your wives are being raped by English troops and all the rest of it. And what would happen? The Irish troops would panic and say, Christ, we're not fighting for the English. And they would just run over the defences towards the French and then start to fight for the French. So the whole point of a siege, what we're talking about, the whole point of a siege is to stop communication getting in and to stop communication getting out, to stop supplies getting in. And in fact, this knowledge of siege warfare goes all the way back, but let's look at one good example. At Elysee, which is a large fort, hill fort. It was a proper hill fort, a defended position somewhere north, east, west of Paris, sometimes south. Huge position, a massive hill fort, which they've never really found. There was 200,000 people held up in there. Vercingetorix said, right, what we'll do, we've got Julius Caesar, right, we all stay here, right, we can last forever because we've got wells and we've got animals, and we can get things in and out. Romans knew this, so they decided to completely encircle it with defences, forts. What the Romans did, they said, "Right, we're not besieging you guys. You can wait a whole year." And they starved them out. Vercingetorix surrendered. He said, "This is dirty warfare, okay? This is terrible, but it worked." And the Romans used it with Masada as well, that huge rock in the Holy Land. And the Jews were held up in Masada, and the Romans said, "Right, we're not going to lose a single life over fighting these Jews, right? What we're going to do, we're going to encircle it with walls." I think there were several sets of walls around the outside with camps all the way around Masada, right? And the Jews poisoned themselves. They lost the will to live. The Romans won the day and they captured Masada. That's a real siege, unfortunately, by not losing life.
What about Carcassonne? Was there a siege there?
Where's that?
Carcassonne in France. You know, the Eugensians.
Oh, those, yes.
Different.
I know what you're talking about. Do you know, I've never been that cult that had a different way of looking at it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. All these things are to starve people out, to break down their will, and that's about siege warfare. The Germans were trying to do it in the Second World War. If you cut the lines of communication between Britain and its empire and America, you'll be able to starve out the British, and it nearly worked. Okay.
That's what they're doing to us now.
No, let's not have that.
The common market and
Wasn't it Montmartre in
on our
France?
own.
In Paris, Montmartre, it's all up on a hill, and they built things around that and starved the people out. Montmartre, where all the art places are, not the.
The Commune rising in 1870. That one.
Yeah, they had that, didn't they? Yeah.
Les Miserables. That's what that's based on. Yeah, is that the place? Yeah.
So it's very effective.
It's very effective. The whole point, the whole, in effect, right, what we always think about warfare, the First World War, we think about the generals just sending their troops over, men, women, animals, and all the rest of it, and whoever's fighting, just send them over. We've got loads of people, right? But that was just nuts. That was siege warfare gone absolute nuts. Because it was a siege, basically it was a siege in a big way. You had a huge trench, all the way across, from Belgium all the way across France and whatever. There was one side, the Germans are on one side, French are on another. It was a huge siege. I don't know who was besieging who, but nobody knows what the First World War was about, right? Nobody really knows, because it was an absolute pointless war. But that's siege warfare on a huge scale. There's an example in the American Civil War, for example, and we've got the first photographs being taken of the trenches in the American Civil War. The Confederate balloons coming up from Richmond, and one thing which was really effective that Grant did to General Lee at Richmond, he basically Grant stopped any Confederate troops coming in to relieve General Lee at Richmond, right? So General Lee decided to leave the trenches on the 2nd of April. And by the 9th of April, 1865, what was left of General Lee's army had surrendered, because these men did not know what was going on, because they'd been involved in this siege for quite some months. Everyone was scared. They didn't know what was going on. And that's how effective siege warfare is, to stop communication. When in fact, heading towards Richmond, there was a Confederate army coming to relieve General Grant. Communication was broken off. If he had waited there, maybe the war would have turned out differently, but it didn't. This is all to do with siege warfare. It's a terrible thing for the person who's being besieged, not knowing what's going on. But it's a very effective way if you're the person who's got the defences, the people who are putting you under the siege. Those are the ones that win, because they can risk nobody's life and they can get away with it. It's the people who have been besieged who are the ones the worst off every single time. And what you could do in the medieval period, people who are being besieged, they used to chuck diseased animals over the walls. And this was one of the other things, that what you need to do is create complete panic. People need to be diseased. They need their food to run out. You need them to be scared and devastated by what was going on. And one of the great victories of the French over the British in the Canadian Wars when was it now? In the 1750s, yeah. 1750s, 1760s. There was a great Montcalm had a great victory over the English, and basically he besieged this fort. I think it was Fort James or something. I can't remember the details, a bit vague. But anyway, they besieged it, and they created this absolute fear that the British just couldn't cope with it anymore. And said, actually, Montcalm, you've won. We're just going to give up the ghost, and we're just going to march out. But anyway, it's all that idea about siege. You've got to keep the siege going, and if you can win by just holding out. But Owen Glyndŵr put Coity Castle under siege, for example, apparently for several years. But what failed is the communication kept going in and out of the castle. So Owen Glyndŵr thought he was getting the upper hand, but because they still knew what was going on, the De Gamas family decided to keep the siege going, and they weren't going to give up the ghost. And Owen Glyndŵr, it was one of the only sites in the whole of Wales that Owen Glyndŵr didn't capture. Because they managed to get communication coming back in. They knew what was going on. Information is really important. Information is important today. If you know what's going on, then you feel a lot more happier. Do you know, we've all been in this situation. There's somebody that we need to keep in touch with. Their mobile phone's down. You don't know what's going on. You start to feel unsure about things. You don't know what's going on. And you start to lose control. That's very important when we look at sieges. Right, well, we'll take a break now. Is there any questions? That's good, I've warned you out.
Where's
Montcalm was a very successful French general.
Oh, in France?
No, in Canada.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's there was Wolfe, and yeah, there was Montcalm was eventually killed. Exactly, James Wolfe.
No, we got
right,
a full cake.
Let's take a break. And a partridge in a pear tree.
A football pitch on top of a stag leap. It's a kite.
What type of balls are we using? Right, okay. This is in fact, I did give you a clue at the beginning of the break. Sort of. We were going to look at.
One of them forts are on fire.
Defences from
Siege.
Yes, from the period of the British Civil War. This is actually from the city of Newark, which was besieged. The parliamentarians besieged the royalists at Newark, and this was one of the besieging fortresses where they encircled it. And there's an interesting piece of archaeology here. And this is really about how archaeologists work today. We've done a vitrified fort bit, but this is another bit of it. After the Civil War in Britain, after the Civil War in America, more importantly after the First World War, what people wanted to do was get back to their everyday lives. Because lots of these wars were political wars. Lots of these wars were fought by people who didn't know what the hell was going on. And lots of people didn't know what the hell was going on in this war. Brothers fighting against brothers, dads fighting against sons, sisters fighting against brothers, and all the rest of it. That's what civil wars are about. But no sooner is a war finished, you want to get back to normal. And particularly in France, for example, the reason why they find so many unexploded ordnance in France and in Belgium at Ypres, Passchendaele and all the rest of it is because the farmers simply wanted to get their land back. It's my bloody land. I've had to put up with this war for 5 years, a political war. I want to get my land back. So what would happen is that everything would be chucked into the trenches, it would be filled over, bones and all, and the farmers would get back to their lives. And in fact, lots of the trenches in France, we have no idea where they were. Because no sooner as the war had finished, before anybody could map them, they were being backfilled. And within a year, the land was ploughed and nobody knew where the trenches were, and that was it. And it's the same with the British Civil War. Even though this has survived, most of the defences, externally and internally, obviously the attackers, externally, internally, the defenders, in places like Reading, Worcester, Bristol, the trenches were being backfilled because farmers wanted their land back. It was their land at the end of the day. Nobody was going to compensate them. And we really don't know where many of these trenches were. Except, what?
Except for the poppies.
Oh no, we're back over to Britain. Yeah, in France, yeah, poppies, yeah, that's fine. But yeah, that's actually, that's not silly, because by looking at some of the plants, you can understand that there's been disturbance under the ground and all the rest of it. So that's not to be dismissed. But the clue is, when you flatten all this is one of the defences that survived. But if you flatten all this, there's a clue to finding where they were. Because what would happen is that these would be pounded by either side. So this is one of the attackers' forts. So this would be pounded by the defenders with artillery. And basically, the cannonballs were just embedded here. When it's all flattened out, we're not talking about metal detecting, we're talking about magnetometry, geophysics. And these will be able to work out where there's concentrations of metal. And those concentrations of metal would undoubtedly be cannonballs. Because what would happen, a cannon would be set up here, cannon would be set up there, and they would practically fire at the same distance over and over again, all day, day in, day out. And there would be a huge concentration of iron in one spot where they tried to make a difference. And it's by looking at those spots can you work out the defences. What used to really frustrate archaeologists, and it still does, is when metal detect enthusiasts, we've got to move on, is when metal detect enthusiasts show an archaeologist a load of musket balls. They say, look what I've got. I found them in that field over there. There was some over there, there was some over there. And the archaeologist is going, yeah, and? Well, this is evidence there was a battle in this field. It might be evidence, but it tells you little. But if the metal detect enthusiasts were going across the ground with the glint machines and they put a flag in where there might be something underneath the surface, archaeologists can work out exactly where the positions of the troops were on the battlefield at any set time. Because what would happen is that you'd have one, because the English battles in the British Civil War were very organised, right? So you might have the royalist side over there, the parliamentary side over there, and their muskets could only get range over a certain distance, and you weren't going to lose your ammunition, you weren't going to waste it. So if you found an alignment of musket balls in the ground, you would know that the parliamentary army was over here, the royalist army was standing here, you know exactly the positions of where the armies were in the battlefield if all those were plotted. But most of the time they're not. And this is something, there's a book being written about this by a certain archaeologist called Pollard and a very unknown archaeologist who none of you will have ever heard of called Neil Oliver. He had a series known as Two Men in a Trench.
Question.
Go for it.
How old was the fort? Who gave a shot?
Okay, precise date, approximately 1643.
How could they possibly have time to dig that out and make a fort in times of warfare? That must be much, much older.
No, these are. I'm actually going to go with divine wisdom on that because the reason why I'm going to go with divine wisdom is that we know places like Worcester, places like Shrewsbury, places like Newark, places like Reading. We know that they were specific localities in the Civil War, and we know that they've all got similar defences and earthworks around them. And it's simply a matter of It's simply a matter of the no man's land strategy. And we see this in the Napoleonic War. If you're trying to besiege a site, the defenders have already built their defences, right? That goes without saying. They've already built them. So then the attackers build their defences at a distance, so they're safe when they're building the defences. What Wellington's army realised in the Peninsular campaign was that they didn't have enough shovels to dig the besieging trenches, and the only shovels that they could get hold of, which were any decent, were ones captured from the French, and apparently a shilling would be given for every shovel captured by an English soldier from a Frenchman. And what would happen is that the trenches would be dug just out of musket ball range. Not rifle range, but musket ball range. You're going to have to take a risk with riflemen. There weren't many of them. Yeah, I'm just going with it, Bill.
Another question as well before you go there.
I haven't answered that question, but I can't.
Your castle was there as well. That was a defensive castle. So why would they actually go to the trouble of doing that when they were?
You missed my earlier point. Cannonballs, stone would soon decimate the castle. That's the point. So they would have defended the castle with earth, the castle walls with earth, and that's the point. And quickly.
If you'd shown me, the thing that got was this, whatever the word is, but I could understand those.
Yeah.
I think it's like half of that quadrangle, but it was the fact that it was a square.
Yeah.
See that it's, I understood
the
work.
You can't, these things can't be, you've got to have these, basically there would be artillery positions on these. And it's all about protecting each other. And Bill, I know your point, but I gotta keep going on this. And then there's one thing, when Time Team had an excavation at a British Civil War site, I think they've only had one or two out of the 200 episodes they did, but they had one, and I think it was a situation where I think it was a parliamentary position was being besieged by the royalists or something odd like that. And then they found this solid gold coin. And usually when archaeologists find solid gold coins, they usually jump up and down and say, oh wow, look what we found, right? I wouldn't be remotely interested, to be frank, because it wouldn't really tell us much. And in fact, the archaeologists on Time Team were the same thinking. They thought, right, we found this gold coin, but it's found with somebody. And the real tragedy is that this person was buried in an unceremonious way, just chucked in a ditch. They weren't even fleeced of their gold; they were just chucked away. And I think what they were trying to get across in Time Team, no matter how much money this guy had, it didn't save him at all. It didn't save his body being buried in a respectful way. And I think that was a very important point. It actually illustrated it really well. The defences themselves are the real tragedy, the real evil of all this. Remember, it's not the military, it's not the people who are being besieged by these earthworks you've got to worry about. It's actually the innocent civilians inside the towns and cities. Those are the ones that were suffering. There are examples in the British Civil War where I think, it was Oxford, I think it was, where the civilians of Oxford were sending messages to the parliamentarian troops, please let us out, the soldiers are going to stay here, but please let us out. And simply the reply back was that we're not going to let you out. As long as you stay there, you're eating the resources, you're drinking the water, you're going to cause more and more problems for the royalists. We're not letting you out. So as the people are actually suffered. And the true tragedy with this type of warfare comes very close to the retreating army of Napoleon in 1812, 1813, when it was retreating from Russia. I think it was late October 1812. It was a very harsh winter, and as they were retreating, hundreds of thousands of his men had typhus, because typhus is spread lice, and it was getting into the clothing and biting the men, and then they would find out that they had typhus and all the rest of it. And as the army was retreating to Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia to try and get to that northern part of the coast to then skirt down into Poland, because obviously the weather was better than actually going through Belarus or Ukraine, evidence that Napoleon's army visited towns and cities, Vilnius rings a bell, isn't to be found in any of the banks or ditches of the defences, because they were all filled in. Is to be found in the crypts of the many churches that are full to the brim of French soldiers who all died of typhus. And that's evidence of the siege, because they were besieged. They weren't allowed out. They weren't allowed any mercy at all by the Russian troops. And Napoleon remarked that he couldn't understand why the Russians fought in this way, a partisan, guerrilla way, when he was saying that warfare is supposed to be about one army facing another army, and he couldn't understand this. And the brutality of that war was that thousands, maybe 100,000+ men died in the cellars and the vaults of many of the churches in agony from typhus, and the bodies were just left there. And then many were just chucked in. Actually, another way of getting rid of the bodies was to chuck them in the ditch, to fill the ditches up with bodies, and that's evidence of a siege. If you find a ditch full of bodies, that's a siege. So in fact, what I'm trying to say is that archaeologists, sensible archaeologists, look at other ways to find evidence rather than the obvious. But there's something very obvious that you can find associated with a siege, and it's this. The only thing that survives in many of these towns and cities built out of timber is the church. Fire of London, 1666. Any of those buildings in London that had survived the Civil War were burnt down in the Great Fire of London in 1666. But many of the churches survived. Sorry, London wasn't really affected as much by the Civil War because that's where the parliamentarians were. That's why the king had his base at Oxford. But in churches in Wiltshire, I was corrected on one detail. I said that all these holes here were actually was evidence of people firing at people inside, outside the walls of the church with muskets. And then somebody said, actually, you're wrong. These are actually, these little pot mats, these tiny small ones, are actually musket ball holes, but these are shrapnel holes. So as the cannonballs land, the bits of shrapnel hit the church wall and strafe it in this dramatic way. So I was corrected on that, and then I made another remark. I said, when I used to go off the train in Barrow and Furness a few years ago, there was a war memorial. As you go to the train station on the left, there's a war memorial, and it's got holes all over it. And I said on Tuesday, I said that's evidence that as the Luftwaffe was dropping its bombs, they were actually firing on civilians. And I was corrected by somebody who was just born after the war. He said that actually the Luftwaffe never shot at civilians. They bombed the hell out of Barrow and Furness, and those holes that look like bullet holes in that war memorial are all shrapnel holes. And I know they are all shrapnel holes, Gilbert was saying, because we used to challenge ourselves when we were children to get the bits of shrapnel out of the war memorial. But all these are evidence of war, even though all the other evidence is gone. Those levels of evidence of war are still there, the bullet holes. So when all the defences have been flattened, you know that a siege has been going on here because of the marks. And another piece of evidence of a siege is to be found in timbers. So you can imagine that you've got timbers of a building, and these timbers have been taken from another building, put in another building. You look at it thinking, there's all musket balls in this. Well, there's certain types of musket balls that we used in the Civil War. The diameter would have changed, okay? The caliber would have changed later on. for new types of muskets and rifles. These are all typical of the Civil War, and these are iron musket balls, and that is a lead musket ball. Whatever was happening to this building, you know, 2 guns, that's evidence of 2 guns being fired. That's one that used iron shot, that's one that used lead. The iron would be signs of these being produced at the beginning of the war, because later on in the war it was easier to melt lead into a hand mould. Obviously you can't melt iron like that. And another sign of the Civil War is this. Raglan Castle. Raglan Castle was absolutely beautiful in 1640, with one of the finest libraries anywhere in Britain. Probably with books and original documents going all the way back to the Roman period and even beyond. Even copies of Herodotus, Ptolemy, even works of Socrates and all the rest of it, second copies or close on near copies in the wonderful library at Raglan. Lord Raglan decided to side with the king, and when he surrendered, his library was set alight, the walls were blown up, and all the defences which defended the site were just completely demolished. The castle was never ever lived in again. The legend of Caerphilly Castle is that the tower at Caerphilly was blown up by a charge of Oliver Cromwell's troops, and that's why it's slanted. More of an acute slant than the Tower of Pisa, but we don't know how much of that is true. But all of these are evidence of the Civil War. Large stacked up bodies, mainly male of a certain age, are usually found. Looking at this, and yeah, we'll have to call it a day in a couple of minutes. This is a Civil War ditch, and this is Worcester. Glacis is the word used as a palisade along the top of the bank here. So that's known as Glacis post holes. This ditch itself is about 5 meters deep still, but the top of it was flattened off, but the ditch itself is still there. Some of the walls around Worcester. Kathy, one of my gang from Lantwit Major, who George can't wait to meet next, she used to live in Worcester, and there are defences still standing in Worcester, but lots of the defences are no longer there. And archaeologists found that. That's undeniable evidence of more of the defences of this period of warfare. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to find a doodah effort. There you go. How is this working when I haven't got my internet on? Breaking news: modern slavery and human trafficking in the UK. Oh, that must be referring to my sting. Basing House, Civil War siege house excavated in 2014. Lots of these houses, as I said, were lost in the Civil War. It was regarded one of the finest in England. Frequent royal visits, destroyed by a siege in 1645. Finding evidence of musket balls. That's how Basing House used to look before it was destroyed in 1645. Built in 1535, so only stood for 110 years. I had a visit from Elizabeth I. John Paulet sided with the Royalists. 360-room house. House breached and captured by Oliver Cromwell's men in 1645. The house completely looted for all its materials, and obviously finding evidence, and they're building a picture of what the site was like. So that's some of the material they found. Lead musket balls on impact. So you can imagine that could have gone through somebody, killed them outright, and hit a wall. So today Keith came in and Steve came in, and they both come in with evidence of warfare. Keith came in with a halved cannonball from the battlefield of Waterloo, and that cannonball had been halved because it had hit a wall. And when that hit the wall, the shrapnel would have killed dozens of people, English and French alike. And we had these musket balls. They were brought in today, and you're just thinking, these things could have been used to kill people, and there it is there. That musket ball could have killed somebody as well because it's dented. And we've got all these different things. We've got window glass. It was a very intense siege, and it brings home what an incredibly violent time it was. It would have been a very frightening time to be alive with food shortages and disorganized armies. And moving on a little bit further, there's books being written, just if anyone's interested. This is Battlefield Archaeology of the Civil War by Langford in 2012. And in London, we're not going to do this, but in London, a place that was not seemingly involved in the Civil War, that's evidence of one of the Civil War defences around London. So they were defences at the time of the Civil War. And moving on a bit further, this is a nice little article here, and I think we'll actually end on this one. There were other things I wanted to do, but we will end on this article. Archaeologists investigate mystery of young Civil War woman buried in unusual grave in Oxford. Archaeologists look to unravel mystery of Lady of St. Cross College, found buried in garden in Oxford after almost 400 years. They found her body. It was found outside consecrated ground, which was unusual. The remains dated from the Civil War. You could tell the skulls in quite a bad state because whatever happened. Eventually become an area of a rubbish tip. They don't really know why she was buried, but she died at the time of the Civil War, maybe murdered. She could have been a prostitute. But she could have died and been buried in haste outside the church walls because the church graveyard was full. It's possible that her death may have coincided with a series of outbreaks of typhus or plague. A typhus epidemic called morbus camprestis, camp fever, was recorded in 1643, and the plagues of 1644 and 1645 during the siege of Oxford by parliamentary forces meant formal burials may have been difficult. So there she is. The overcrowding and insanitary conditions recorded in the town during this period was a result of billeting of royalist officers and their families, and were highlighted as a potential cause for the outbreaks. So it's not just affecting men, it's affecting children. And finally, writing at the time, the nastiness, filth and stinking odours befalling the King's garrison at Oxford. Descriptions: an army physician, malignant and contagious fever, symptoms including a weak, creeping pulse, fever, vertigo, vomiting, severe chills and purple spot. Even though that wouldn't show in these bones, she was obviously found. What's that?
We're both in chin.
Oh, bloody hell. Not all people died, but obviously we got somebody who died close to this building here. 40 people dying per week. 200 individuals being buried in St. Mary Magdalene's churchyard at that period in Oxford. Coins being used, shillings placed above people's eyes. And it's said that all of this shows these little bits of evidence. An individual like this being buried at the time of the Civil War. Again, death is a sure sign of siege. People are able to get out. Usual rules are dispensed with. People are not buried in church graveyards. They're being buried outside them, and so on. The tradition is that people would have coins over their eyes, and the coins over their eyes at the point of burial would prevent people seeing that the eyeball had collapsed and stuff, so the person would still be in an okay state, presentable state when they're being buried. All signs, evidence of sieges.
I thought they would pay the Christmas.
Yes, but if you've got a shilling over each eye, there you go. What I'm going to do is call it a day now, because obviously time is getting on. So, are there any questions, folks?
Yeah, go on, Carl.
Go for it.
Did you give the names of any forts you could visit?
Yeah, there are names. Unfortunately, the article that I had, which showed a list of 10 of them, another one in translation has been lost. So vitrified. Oh, I'd have to put the computer back on, but here we go. If you go onto the internet, it's called "Uncovering the Secrets of Scotland's Vitrified Forts." Look that one up on the internet. If you type in vitrified forts, it'll give you a list. Are there any questions?
Where was that wall? It looked like underneath the building you showed.
In the heart of London.
Yeah.
That was. Where does it show? That was.
Seemed to be a well.
Oh, there you go. An excavation under Rathbone Place and Newman Street, and this is actually pile driving from the 1950s or 60s, supporting a concrete floor above, and they just excavated underneath. So there you go. If there's no more questions, have you all enjoyed this today? Thank you very much, folks. I'll have your eggs tomorrow. Thank you very much. I'll see you all next week. And next week we're looking at glass. Glass.
Are you eating that, or do you want this to wrap it up?
Yeah, I'm eating it now, love, innit? Like, you know.
Another cup of tea?
And you haven't collected all the cups yet.
I know.
I'll eat that now. Hang on.
You said veg. Did you want some more tea?
No, I'm okay, love.
You're an asshole. They're ordinary actually.
I'll give that to Anne. I'll give that.
Yeah.
I'll give that to Misha, my girl. La 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 la
It's
la
not,
la.
no. So it's not an invitation. It's just telling you about the
I'll have it
actual
there. No one
card.
goes, yeah.
It was an invitation. Now it's on to the 24th.
All right then.
I thought, what's her name? Kathy would be.
She might be.
Good era.
Yeah.
Polish jeans. North Wales.
We all sort that out.
North Wales.
In North Wales.
Yeah.
Why have you got an unusual cut there? That one there. Anyway, I'll see you in a minute. What's that, Doc?
I haven't quite decided on that.
Alright, then, no, that's fine. I'll have that.
But there's a souvenir.
Hang on, I'll bring this now, John. Hang on. Anyway, thanks, folks. I'll see you all next week, John. Don't rush back.
Now you've had the membership, don't rush back.
Don't rush back. It was good, it was. Right, God, and you've got to put a plate in the kitchen.
Yeah. No problem. If I can't find it, then leave it. Upside down, you did a mess again.
I cleaned it off, my dear.
George went back at the chair.
Oh, you know. I hate it when that happens.
So we're in the same room next week?
Yes, but not in September. It's for one day it changes, but not yet.
All right, okay. It's like being at school, isn't it, Bill? Is that your pen?
Oh, hang on, is that your pen? Oh, no, it's not mine. No, that's George's.
That's
George's.
George's
Oh,
little
that's
tin of
George's.
biscuits.
Hey? What's that?
George's little tin of biscuits.
No, you did that was in the cupboard.
Oh.
Move!
I bet you're going to stand outside and see you tomorrow night. See you lads.
I wonder if Davey John's coming tomorrow.
See you.
And those two that go over there.
What two? Yeah, I know they do. I know.
No, they normally go down the chairs, don't they?
Over there.
Well, that's what I have.
Glenda, what's the name of your husband? John?
No, Alan. Alan Parry.
Oh, hang on a minute. You know you've done your membership, right?
Yeah.
I'll take your frigging money off you. You've got to fill it. Before you go, fill in that.
God. They'll be waiting out there in a minute.
Don't worry, he's a bloke.
Right.
Oh no, just chuck it in quickly.
Oh, what?
Do you want me to write it out?
Yeah.
What is it?
My name.
Yeah.
I know my name.
Glenda Parry.
Yeah.
Right, address?
5
5
Clos Glyndŵr.
Clos
Glyndŵr, like an Owen.
Yeah.
Park Derwin.
Park Derwin, yeah.
Coity.
Oh, you're one of those. Yeah, go on. Go on.
CF35.
Yeah.
6AX.
Is that weird estate?
Oh, God, no, this is real estate.
Oh, yeah, those. Phone number 0.
Oh, 01656.
Yeah.
Can't remember the rest, seriously.
Alright, no, that's fine. Yeah, we've got that. Job, don't worry.
What's in here? Oh, no, that's phone number. I've got my mobile number there.
Oh, let's do that again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll read it out again.
I can't because I've got my glasses on.
Funny French person.
French?
Yeah.
Just because I know a bit about France.
Le route est longue, le plan d'espoir. Soif, soif, jusqu'au bout.
Oh, you're showing off now.
Mon corps résiste encore. Je m'appelle Karl. Oui.
I know you are. Carl. Right, I'll see you tomorrow.
I miss you tomorrow.
I hope it's not raining, Carl.
I hope it is because it's nice.
It makes it more atmospheric, does it?
It does. No, actually, I like it when it's wet because it's like it.
Makes it look against town.
Yeah, it makes it miss.
It's not hard overall. See,
No, it's not. It's
Okay,
not.
that's good.
It's one mile there and 1 mile.
Oh, because he said to me, you didn't ask how far it was. Do you know, I rang you last week.
Yeah.
And I went, oh, no, I forgot about that. Because if it's a long way, I can't do it
It's
anymore.
not.
Great. I'm looking forward to that.
Good, I'm glad you are.
I didn't walk through the door. I'll see you tomorrow then, Carl.
Solid.
I could walk through. Fine.
You could have.
Yeah.
You would have been a superwoman. Superwoman. See you, Glenda. Take care, bye. Enjoy. See you tomorrow. Take care, bye. Bye. Bye.
Time, oh, call to. The time is being equal to.
Hello, goodbye, hello to the country club. Oh, Bill, do you want to come to the country club with me? There's all the boys there.
I won't be here next week.
Oh, bastard. You won't be here next week?
No,
I'm going on my bloody
I'm
trip.
on my way back from Edinburgh.
See you, Bill.
I'll be going.
George, you were fortnight.
Fortnight.
Yeah.
Well, you're off next week, are you?
I'm going to sunny Bolton next week.
Where?
Bolton.
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 Not to watch footy, is it?
Bolton under, thank you for blood.
Alright, I'll see you then.
Ta-ra, George.
I'll see you. I'll keep moving.
Ta-ra. Ta-ra.
Well, be back now. Would help. What?
Where's the 8th? What's gone?
Well, we finally got another lady who talks more than Dorothy anyway, I mean.
Well, I think she seems to have settled into it.
Yeah, she's quite, she's obviously...
But will she last the distance? Same as us?
Who are we on about?
I mean, I was getting bored today.
What?
Until you started talking about sieges. Real sieges, you know. Look, I've been indoctrinated from 2009 that the Iron Age people weren't warlike. So I know that.
Yeah, but Bill doesn't, because Bill's a bit slow.
And neither did.
Two.
Well, it depends
Three.
whether Bill believes it.
Bill don't believe shit.
Believe what?
Bill believes that the...
That the Iron Age people didn't.
Bill believes that all people in life
We're brilliant.
are brilliant. And in fact, Bill believes that there should be a ball in every town.
Oh,
If
Carl.
you think about it, every generation going back thousands of years must have been very clever to survive to generate the next generation.
Every generation.
Oh, yeah.
Joe.
Well, this generation is that white people living off the face of the earth. Soon.
Will we?
Well, Koreans, and nutcase at the end of that.
In that case, it's everywhere.
No.
Well, look at this room. 5, 6.
And you got him, that Korean man, nutcase. And then you got Trump.
We're only told he's a nutcase.
Talk to him.
No.
Talk to him in his usual, like droll way, And I don't hold much hope, really.
I don't feel he's not going to last.
50.
Trump. No, well, Joe doesn't think he's going to last.
It's not going to last the term of office. It's going to be feelings.
Oh, it's going to be so embarrassing. Well, but
60.
somebody might assassinate him. I think someone will shoot him.
55.
He's
70.
well,
71.
I don't want to say that because,
74.
He'll either be assassinated or he'll be impeached for something.
Well, it didn't work with Bill Clinton. They wanted to
I
win.
mean, they're too well protected now, aren't they?
The American people elected Donald Trump for a reason.
Yeah, of course. It's bound to be a reason.